Blackbear, a renegade Sioux who struck it rich mining gold in the 1800s, was Joe's grandfather. He took the boy in and raised him on his ranch, but the Mafia finally caught up with him and assassinated Blackbear when Joe was 17. After that, Sergeant Duffy could see that Joe's anger was going to be a problem, and he didn't think Joe was ready to stand up to the Mafia on his own. The sergeant was in tight with Eisenhower, and he had the pull to get Joe into his platoon, where they cleaned out caves full of North Koreans in South Korea. He hoped the boy could let off some steam under his guidance. Even though combat was dangerous, Sergeant Duffy figured Joe would be able to stay alive and out of jail long enough to finish growing up. After leaving Korea, Joe went back to his grandfather's ranch to find that the Mafia had talked his attorney into selling off all the cattle. The attorney had taken the money to Chicago and opened a restaurant, where he paid the Mafia 10% to stay in business. Joe hit Chicago ready to settle the score with the attorney. He was driving a blue Ford truck from the 40s and wearing his father's hat and jewelry. He still wore his father's Indian chief ring on his left ring finger. He had put it on the day his father was killed, and since then, his finger had grown too thick to take it off, which suited him fine. He also wore his father's gold chief bracelet on his left wrist. His necklace was a thick gold chain with a bear pendant made of gold. The bear appeared to stand on his hind legs and had diamonds for eyes. His mother and Uncle Jack were living in a cheap apartment on the south side of town. Jenny opened the door. "Hey, Ma, surprised to see me?" Joe said. "Jesus Christ, son, I was afraid I'd never see you again." Joe wrapped his arms around her and lifted her off the ground, saying, "You know better than that, Ma." He squeezed her tightly and kissed her cheek. When he put her down, she said, "Well, you sure grew into a strong and handsome young man." Jack was standing in the living room, and Joe went over to shake his uncle's hand. "What, you think you're too old to give your uncle a hug?" Jack asked him. The two men hugged each other standing in the living room. When they broke apart, Joe bent down to hug his little brother, who was around 8.5. Standing up, Joe asked his uncle, "So what do you know about John Bradbury?" "I know he opened up the restaurant with money from your grandpa's cattle." "You know where the restaurant is?" Jack nodded. "Oh, yeah." "What do you say we ride over there and pay him a visit?" asked Joe. "He's paying Olivetti and Campanero for protection." "So?" Joe shrugged. Jack looked at him. "You ain't going to get us killed, are you?" "You scared?" "No, I just want to know what you got in mind." "I'm going to get my money back," said Joe. "How?" "I'll figure it out when we get there." Jack shook his head and sighed. "Just don't get us killed." They walked outside, and Joe grabbed his father's gun belt from underneath the seat of the truck. Jack was still driving the chief's Cadillac, so they drove it over to Bradbury's Steakhouse. Almost everyone there remembered Joe. Many of them were drunks and gamblers who missed his father's leadership. With the chief out of the way, the Mafia had the uncontested run of the town. Joe wore a full-length black leather blazer to cover the gun belt. His light brown face was covered with black stubble, and there was a look of determination in his deep blue eyes. He was in his early 20s, but his physique and ruggedness gave him the presence of a much older man. In the restaurant, Joe saw the ex-attorney Bradbury sitting at a table with Olivetti, Campanero, and a bunch of other people. Campanero's legs started to hurt when he saw Joe approaching the table. "Hey, look who's here! It's the little chief!" he sneered. Bradbury was the first to rise from his seat. Before he had a chance to say or do anything, Joe punched him in the forehead with a left jab. Bradbury staggered backward. Joe hit him with his left again, then a right hook that spun Bradbury around before he dropped to his knees. By this time, women were screaming and men were preparing to do something. Joe picked Bradbury up by the lapels of his coat and slammed him onto the table in front of Campanero and Olivetti. Dishes and silverware crashed to the floor. Olivetti thought about doing something, but he knew Joe had been driven mad and was likely to kill several people before they could stop him. He had known Joe since he was a baby and felt bad about his father and grandfather being murdered. Campanero waited for Olivetti to make the call. When Olivetti remained silent, he said, "Hey, Joey, remember what happened to your father?" Joe had Bradbury laid out on the table. He looked at Campanero. "Remember what happened to your leg?" Bradbury was scared shitless. He had watched Joe grow up on the ranch, and he remembered Joe and his grandfather playing catch with a tomahawk. Now he noticed the same tomahawk hanging on the left side of Joe's gun belt. He turned his head to Olivetti and shouted, "What the hell am I paying you guys for?" Two of Olivetti's men started to move forward, but Olivetti motioned them to stop. Joe pulled the chief's Colt out of its holster and stuck the barrel in Bradbury's mouth. "I figure you owe me about 500 grand. Got it?" Bradbury remembered Joe's grandfather making him drive a nail into a tree from 50 feet away with that gun before he could have dinner. He shook his head from side to side, afraid Joe would pull the trigger. "You got a safe in the office?" Bradbury slowly nodded. Joe pulled the gun out of Bradbury's mouth, saying, "Let's go take a look at it." He pulled Bradbury off the table and gave him a push. "Hey, Chief," Olivetti called to him, still sitting at the table. "You better watch your ass." That was the first time anyone had ever called Joe Chief. It made him proud, but he knew he had some serious business to take care of before he deserved to be called the Chief. There was about $50,000 in the safe. Joe pocketed the money and said, "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to sign the restaurant over to me, and I'm not going to kill you. Does that sound like a good deal?" "Why should I do that? I pay the outfit a lot of money for protection," Bradbury said. Joe lit a cigar and said, "Yeah, and they're doing a real good job protecting you, aren't they?" Jack chuckled. Bradbury said, "All right, if I sign it over, then it's gonna be it, right?" "As long as you don't give me any shit. You even think about making trouble for me, and I won't think twice about blowing your fucking head off." Bradbury knew Joe was serious. "I'm lucky to be alive, and I never should have listened to Campanero in the first place," he thought. Campanero had sworn to protect him if he sold the chief's cattle and moved to Chicago, but he can now see that Campanero was full of shit. He said, "All right, I'll do it." Joe took a hit off his cigar and said, "See there? It's your lucky day." His eyes shifted to Bradbury's gold and diamond watch. "Just one more thing. I need a watch, and yours looks pretty nice." Bradbury unfastened it and handed it to the chief. Joe put it on his right wrist and said, "It's a little tight, but it looks pretty good. You're giving it to me, right?" "Yeah, what the hell?" "Good. Now let's get down to business."